Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In the last video we have seen how would you use Microsoft Recovery Services Vault to backup Azure file shares. In today's video we are going to backup Microsoft SQL Server on an Azure Virtual Machines. When it comes to SQL Server, there are a variety of different flavors that you can use over Microsoft Azure. The first flavor is going to be installing SQL Server on an Azure Virtual Machine, which is the unmanaged option. A lot of customers use this today. And it's a similar situation like if you're managing the on-premises SQL Server on a virtual machines that exist on Hyper-V or VMware virtual environment. The common use cases for Microsoft SQL Server on a virtual machine is basically I want to take full control of my SQL Server, I want to use the full feature of SQL Server and more. There are other options which some customers might use if they don't have full experience of managing SQL Server, or maybe they have some simple database need and they don't really want to manage the SQL Server. They don't want to manage the replication. They don't have the knowledge about all of these kind of stuff. Then they go for the Azure PaaS offering, and the Azure PaaS offering consists of two different things. Like the first one is going to be the Azure SQL database or Azure SQL managed instance. The Azure SQL database is the managed offering from Microsoft, where you don't really need to worry about the management of the underlying database, such as updates or maybe backups, disaster recovery, and more. And also the Azure SQL managed instance is giving you the 100% compatibility and the full features as if you're running this on an Azure virtual machine or on premises, but on a managed instance. So basically, Microsoft does manage that for you. Today we are going to see two examples of how can you create an Azure Virtual Machine with SQL Server pre-installed, and then we will create a sample database test one, and then test out the Azure Backup. How would you backup and restore? And the second demo is going to be, I'm going to show you also how would you backup and restore an Azure SQL database. So let's jump into the Azure portal. All right, I'm in the Azure portal. If you were following the playlist, so in the last video we have created a Microsoft Recovery Services Vault, which act as our backup solution. So as I mentioned previously, it's a unified solution for backup and disaster recovery. Now, let's take a look at the virtual machines we have. So I have two virtual machines here. This one I have created is acting as a SQL Server database. So as you can see here, it's a Windows 22 data center with SQL Server Web. And I'm just doing this because basically just to save some cost, but you can select the SQL Server version that you require or based on your needs. So it can be standard, can be enterprise, whatever. So to create a SQL Server machine, basically what you need to do is just to create an Azure Virtual Machine here. Select your resource group. In my case, I'm going to select the backup resource group. And as any other resource, you always have to select subscription if you have more than one subscription. But for me, I only have one subscription. So by default, I will only see my Azure subscription or single Azure subscription. Give it a descriptive name. And then select the Azure region. For me, I'm just going to select no infrastructure redundancy because I'm not going to create high availability for the SQL Server. And then I'm going to select my images. So by default, you won't see the SQL Server here. It's only going to be Windows or Linux machines, the most common ones. But to view all of the images, you need to click on the See All Images here. From See All Images, you can search for Microsoft SQL Server and click Enter. You'll see a variety of different versions of Microsoft SQL. So what we will do here, I'm going to select the SQL Server Web on 2022 on Windows Server 2022 as well. I'm not going to go through all of the creation process. Again, we're not targeting this is not a SQL class, but I'm just showing you where to get the image from. So I'm going to specify the VM username and password. One more thing here, that you can control the connectivity. So if you want this machine to access the SQL Server port itself over the private network, which means is that only virtual machines from the site-to-site or VPN, site-to-site VPN or express route will be able to contact, like the SQL Server over that 1433 port. You can always modify that one, or even you can do also over the public internet. But for sure, for security reason, you always have to stick with the private or within the virtual network. Also, I will enable the SQL Server authentication. However, Microsoft Entra always the best option. So you can also enable Microsoft Entra and SQL authentication if you would like to. And you can integrate with Azure Key Vault for storing passwords and so on. And then hit create. All right, the VM created successfully. So you always can click on go to resource if you want to go directly after this guy completed. But we always can also search from here, search for virtual machines, and then click virtual machines. Let me just leave this. As you can see, VM SQL Server 02 has been successfully created in the West Europe. Click on that VM, and then let's gain an operating system access. So to do that, you always can click on connect and then hit connect, or you can copy the public IP address from here. This is not the best case from a cybersecurity perspective. You always, when you have a database, you always remove the public access and always use the private IP address. But for this, it's just a testing environment, so I'm gonna use a public IP, and I've also allowed the remote desktop or RDP protocol from the network interface or the network security group. So just open MSTSC. So from the run menu here, you can click on start run and then type MSTSC and then paste the public IP. Hit connect. And if the firewall rule is enabled, then you should be good to go. So I'll just use a different email address. I'm gonna type the username and then the password. Click OK. So this is a vanilla image from Microsoft with no customization. Normally, in the enterprise world, you always have to customize your VM, install the agents you want, and so on. But for testing purposes, we're just using a pre-built SQL Server image from Microsoft Marketplace, that's what we call it. And then we can click on the SQL Server Management Studio to manage the databases and so on. So it takes some time till it gets started. This is a very slow machine, so I'm just using it for testing purposes. So let's wait till the SQL Server Management Studio be up and running. All right, because the database engine installed locally on this machine, so we don't need to do much. You always can use the authentication method you want. So there are different flavors, as I mentioned. It could be Windows authentication, it could be SQL Server authentication, Microsoft Entra, and so on. So whatever is the use case, I'm just gonna hit connect. So now it's connecting to the VM SQL Server 2. Let me just try the login as well. Trust the server, connect. Now we are connected successfully to the database. So if you can see here, by default, the system database is going to be created like the master model and so on. This is not a SQL Server class, but I just want to show you. And then you can create new database from here. And then hit test 01. And then click OK. We have now created a new test database. This is the logins, and this is where you can control you or add extra users and so on, or even integrate with Microsoft Active Directory. For an older SQL Server version, you always have to create a login for the Azure Backup. Like, if you have Windows Server 2008 and SQL Server older version, then you have to do that. but for the newer versions, you don't need to worry about this. But we will see that later. The reason why is that you need certain permissions to be added from the login side, which I will show you on the documentation, so that the Azure Backup extension will be able to locate the SQL Server and will be able to, create backups and restore, so have certain permission on the, the SQL Server side. But we will see now that this is what's going to happen with the SQL Server database. So if we go back from here, now I'm in the Azure portal, go back to the Microsoft Recovery Services Vault, select the backup one. You will see here under backup item, I have already enabled one SQL Server database installed on another virtual machine. So now what I will do is I will also enable another example. So we're going to go from the getting started section here under backup and then select Azure SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machine. Then I will start to run a discovery. This is where I'm talking about is that if you're not configuring a login for that service, basically the discovery won't be able to work. Right, as you can see here, we have successfully discovered VM SQL 02. The reason why we don't see 01 because we already discovered that, so it won't appear here. But also gonna give you a note here, if you have a SQL Server Enterprise or Standard for always on clusters, ensure that all nodes are in the same geographical location as the Recovery Services Vault, which means is that if you have multiple replicas of a primary and secondary SQL Server database, they always have to exist, or they must exist on the same region as the the Microsoft Azure Backup. So for the secondary one, if you have a disaster recovery replica, then you also want to make sure to create another vault for that one. For this one, we're just going to select the SQL Server or the standalone one, and then it's going to go ahead and start to discover this virtual machine. So once it's discovered, we will be able to click on Configure Backups. This is where we can see the SQL Server databases itself. So now what we're doing is we're discovering the SQL Server itself, or the server itself, not the actual databases. Then the second step is to discovering the databases, such as the system databases, the test database that we have created, and so on. As you can see, the database discovery has been successfully finished. So deployment succeeded. Now we can configure backups. So either can view the details, what's going on here. So basically what happens is it's registered the VM to the Recovery Services Vault. And from the details here, it says there are 4 databases found. So to go back, I'm just gonna click here to go back, and then I will do configure backups. Right, so this is the policy section. Again, this is the pre-built one from Microsoft, and I promised that there will be an explanation of how would you create the backup policy, what it is, and how would you control all of this. But basically, we're just creating a backup frequency. You always can create new one, and what happen is gonna take the backup or trigger the backup for a specific time in a day, and you always have to take a full backup every week, for example, and then differential backups to save cost. So now it's just asking you which policy you're going to relate to this databases. So we're selecting this policy or the pre-built one, and then we're going to add the database. So as you can see here, it's showing me I can actually do auto protect as well, which means that every SQL Server database is going to get created, then it will be automatically onboarded to Microsoft Backup Vault. But what I'm going to do is you always can select all, so which means I want to back up the system databases plus the extra databases, or even I'm just going to select the test 01 here and then click OK. So I only enabled backups on an individual specific database here, so I'm just going to click on enable, and it will take some time till it's successfully created. Okay. All right, it was configured successfully, so it took around a few minutes as well. Again, you know where to exactly identify, so by just looking into the backup jobs, and then you will be able to exactly spot how much time does it take. So as you can see, the total duration is 5 minutes. The registration took 4 minutes. This is just related to the older database that I've created before this demo. So now if I go to the backup items here under protected items, I should be able to see 2 virtual machines registered successfully. So if I click here, I can see two test 01's database, but this one for the SQL Server virtual machine 1, and test 01 also in VM SQL 02. So this is on the secondary VM. So again, this is before the demo or before my video, and this one still, the full backup is pending. So what we can do now is to click on view details and then click on backup now. Again, what type of backup? So as I mentioned, the full backup must be triggered, and then anything else is differential to save cost. I'll just keep I'll just keep this backup till today, and to save also some data or to save some cost, you can also enable compression, but this will increase the restore time objective, right? So you always have to think about cost versus the time. It's totally up to you, and it depends on the database importance. Okay, so the backup now triggered successfully. So let's take a look at what's happening from the SQL Server on the operating system layer. So remember, I told you that a login should be created. So if I refresh from here, I should be able to see a login. So let me just try to see refresh. And then go back to the security under logins. As you can see, there is an NT service, Azure Windows L Backup plugin. So this is the this is the backup agent, basically Windows Server login backup. So this is basically where Azure Backup push the extension and then create the login on your SQL Server itself. So if I also go from the files and features here, or maybe control panel. I'm also gonna see Azure Workload Backup. So this is basically the backup agent that got installed. If I wanna also confirm more, then I can go from the Azure portal itself under Virtual Machine and then click on SQL Server, the SQL Server instance, and then I should see also extensions plus application, and then I can see Azure Backup Windows Workload. This is basically the Azure Backup agent that gets pushed. One thing I forgot to mention in my videos is that any VM that gets created in the cloud, you're always going to use the Azure Backup extension, right? Anything outside of Azure, there are different type of agents that we will discuss later. But for now, you know that there is an Azure Backup extension agent that gets installed on the virtual machine or on the SQL Server database, or from the control plane, just for managed services to communicate with Azure Storage account, for example. There is no agents, but it has a way where it can contact the Azure Storage and then start creating backup from the file server, like the example that we have seen in the last video. All right, if we go back to the Recovery Services Vault, let's just monitor the backup job. So backup jobs here, right now, the full backup operation is in progress, and it's been running for 2 minutes. So let's wait till it finishes, and then we will test a backup and restore as well. All right, the backup has been successfully created. So as you can see, the total duration was 3 minutes. Again, this is a small database, so it explains why it took that minutes. But if we look into the Azure SQL database now too, you will see the status change from warning to healthy, and then same interface, like a snapshot, the type is full backup, and then the vault is standard, and so on. So that's it for regarding the backup. So now if we go back here, let's try to delete the SQL database. So I'm going to go for the database here and then right click, delete. Close existing no problem. There is no connection on the database. So now the database, like there is no database. So as you can see, it's only the system databases, or the like the ones that use the SQL Server use. So if I go back here, I'm gonna restore. Again, where do you want to restore this one? So it's either alternate location. You can restore it as a file. You don't need to really recover the database. Or I'm just gonna select the original location. So in the original location, will automatically detect, of course, the registered virtual machine, and then you can select the restore point. In my case here, this is the restore point, the last one. And again, you can, you can also choose this option to restore with no recovery, but I'll just leave the default here. So, and then click OK. So let me just click on OK, and then click OK. Now it's running the restore job. So if we go back here, under the backup jobs again, it's in progress. All right, I think the restore job is successfully completed. Let me just refresh, because it was showing me here trigger for restore was successful. Let me just take a look here. Oh, it's still in progress. So now what happens is transferring the backup data from the vault, or the hot snapshot, to the to the Azure SQL database. Sorry, to the Azure Virtual Machine SQL Server database. I just want to make sure that I'm accurate. While this gets created, again, this is where I was talking about. This is how would you backup and restore the Azure Virtual Machines. So the Azure Virtual Machines, I mean for SQL Server. So you will see here that Microsoft Azure Backup provide a 15 minutes restore recovery point objective, which is really good. And point in time recovery up to second. So you will see here, these are the details about, the basically the Azure Backup with Microsoft SQL. And you will see here that regarding the login that I was referring to, is that if you have an older version of Microsoft SQL Server, then you need to use or add this this login basically to be able to run discovery and so on. So Windows NT Service, and then Azure WL Backup plugin SVC. If it's a newer version, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, then you don't need to add that login at all. So it will be automatically created. This is also another documentation that I will leave it on the YouTube description, is talking about the different agents that Microsoft Azure Backup use. So you'll see that with the Azure Virtual Machines, it uses the Azure Backup extension. If you want to backup files and folders system state, then you use the Mars agent, and this is going to be on premises. If you want to integrate with System Center Data Protection Manager, or DPM, then you can actually you can do that as well if you have one. If you don't have one, then you can use the Microsoft Azure Backup Server. So it's a server that or a software that you install on a Windows operating system, where it's exactly the same as DPM. So if you don't have DPM, then you can use the Microsoft Azure Backup Server, which is also a free version that we provide from the service. And then you can push that agents. So it's the same scenario, the same thing. So again, this is the on-premises backup support. If you want to do Azure Backup support, you will see here that these are the data or the considerations. These are the options. Again, different types of agents that you can leverage with the Azure Backup side, but the most common one is the Azure VM Backup using VM extension. So this is where you can back up the VM, and this is what's showing you exactly the kind of the agents that we manipulate or use. But again, you can also use the Azure Backup Server or the backup server from on-prem, the same one. You can install it on a virtual machine on Azure and then start to do the same thing. So no problem at all. But you will see these are the common use cases. This are the considerations with Linux. It is so important to read and take a look at or look at these documentations before you implement the Azure Backup. I will leave this on the description again, as I mentioned, just to know that there are different Azure Backup extensions, different Azure Backup agents for different purposes. There will be a dedicated session for the Azure Backup agents where we're gonna discuss exactly which type of agents we're gonna install when we go to the on-prem, which type of agents we're gonna use if we are backing files and folder on-prem, and so on. It's a lot of agents. It's kind of confusing, but because of Microsoft Backup does a lot of capabilities and a lot of feature. One of the biggest one is you can also back up an AKS infrastructure. So if you have an Azure Kubernetes services, you can also enable backup, which we will see on one of the videos. I haven't done it before, but I will just do it on my lab environment and then come back to you regarding this. But I just want to let you know that this is a capability that exists today. Now let's go back here and take a look if it's finished or not. Okay, so the restore job has been successfully completed from the Azure portal, as you can see. So again, the data transferred in megabytes, the job type is recovery, and then transfer from the vault is completed. So if I go back to my RDP session, remember the database snapshot wasn't there. So if I hit refresh here, I should be able to see it coming back. So as you can see, test 01 is successfully restored, and again, you won't lose your database. All right, finally, I just want to show you that to use a SQL Server now, this is just a SQL Server on an Azure Virtual Machine. But now if you are using an Azure SQL database, then it's different. You don't need to use actually Microsoft Azure Backup. But since we are talking about SQL Server, I just want to show you here. We're gonna create an Azure SQL 1, and then we create a new logical server here, which is act as a VM, but you don't see it behind the scenes. So I will just say logical 1, and then let's create it on UK West. Okay, maybe UK South. Yeah. And then as you can see here, this is the authentication mode. So basically I can say, hey, use both SQL and authentication, and then I can select my intra admin. So I will select my account. Then I will enter also the SQL Server login here. Notice here that the creation is a bit different, but I just want to show you here that also you can configure the backup automatically out of the box here, but there is no recovery services vault needed here. So this is built inside the service itself. So I'll just select locally redundant to save some cost, and then, or even geo redundant, it's okay. Then hit next. Networking, I can also allow public access just to be able to access the server, and then I will add my current device or my current Windows machine where I'm working on. Then next. Hit next. It's all very simple, and then review and create. So as you can see, this is a very small database, so the estimated monthly cost is $5, nothing much. So I can create. As you can see, the Azure SQL database have been successfully created. So to access the Azure SQL database, you just need to go to SQL servers. And then you will see your SQL Server database created successfully. Again, no RDP, no operating system access, no managing for high availability, and so on. Of course, you need to change the redundancy option, but this is the managed service offering compared to the virtual machine. So it's a completely different experience. And you can always connect using the connection strings, or even with the Azure Data Studio. So you have to install the management studio on the local machine, and then you can connect. Again, you can use a jump virtual machine to connect to this database, but I just want to show you here how would you basically back up this one. So this is the actual SQL Server database. So we have to go by the logical server. So as you can see, we have created a logical server one, and then the SQL one is the database itself. So if we go back here, we can search for SQL Server. We will see two options here. The first one are your available databases, which is SQL 1. And then to view your SQL logical databases, then this is the actual server that's hosting your database. So this is the logical one. This is where you're going to configure the backups. So basically, what you need to do is to scroll down to data management here, and then you will see backups. So for the backups here, you will see that the moment you create the Azure SQL database, it's automatically trigger a full-time backup, full backup snapshot, and then you will be able to also restore. So we'll see here, these are the backup or the recovery points that is automatically created. So you can see this, is actually explaining Azure SQL database are backed up automatically. So backup is enabled by default on managed services. You don't need to use an Azure Backup server. You don't need to use Azure Backup or Recovery Services Vault. It's automatically going to be done for you. Then if you click on the retention policies, this is where you can configure the retention policy. So by default is gonna be 7 days of point time recovery, and then these are the backups or the backup types. So if we click here on or select this policy, we can actually remove the settings or even configure the policies. And you can actually increase the point in time restore. You can also change the differential backup, and then also you can configure the backup retentions, such as I want to keep the snapshots maybe for 6 months, or maybe I want to keep it for 6 years, and so on. So this is where you configure it from the Azure SQL side. Again, this is off topic from the Microsoft Azure Backup, but since we are talking about the databases, this is where you can configure it. Last thing I just want to show you also that you can control also the backup options. If I go here, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I found it here, so I just forgot. So if you go back to the SQL databases, your SQL one, if I go to compute plus storage here, then I will be able to see the backup storage redundancy. So as you can see, this is where you can control if you selected, for example, locally redundant backups, then you can actually scale it down and then just select the locally redundant. Then it will switch from G redundant to locally redundant. So this will take some time till the effect is gonna change, but this is pretty much how it works. Also, one more great thing that for the AI people that they maybe bringing a SQL database or the what we call it relational database, maybe it has some sales data and so on. You can actually also integrate with Azure AI Search. So you can connect to an Azure AI Search service, and this is where you can synchronize the data or part of this data to the Azure AI Search, which act as a vector database, and then maybe connect it to the Azure OpenAI service and then chat with your own data. Now, the Azure OpenAI service will learn about what is inside your database, and then it can gives you kind of answers, maybe, hey, give me the last maybe flights or whatever. I don't know, that depends on your use case, but you can really search on this database and see what's going on. And all of this are integrated from your own private data, connected to the Azure AI Search, which act as a vector database, does indexing and so on, and then also connected to the Azure OpenAI, which is leveraging your SQL Server or the relational database. Of course, you can bring many different types of databases, many types of data, but this is just one example that I want to highlight here. Sorry for a 30 minutes plus video that I've recorded, but there were a lot of things that I would like to clarify here in this video. So that's it for today's video. We have learned about the different types of Azure SQL or SQL Server flavors that you can use over Microsoft Azure. We have seen how would you enable backups, how would you restore your databases. We have seen also the different flavor or the Azure SQL database, how would you backup and restore the different features that you can use with Azure SQL as well. I hope this video was useful for you. Thanks for watching.